It's the final few months of your campaign, and it's going to focus mostly on field operations, the importance of having a field operations, and how important it is to campaigns. And we're fortunate to have a couple of repeat guests do their expertise in field operations. Fortunately, Aaron Ver, who was on your schedule, had a scheduling conflict. He couldn't make it at the last minute. So we're fortunate to have Casey and Simone back to express their experience with field operations specifically. And we also have State Representative Alex Cornell DeHoo. Alex represents Brunswick in the Maine State Legislature, and as a Marine reservist, he interrupted his schooling at Bowdoin College to deploy to Fallujah in 2006 as an infantry assaultman. He is the former National Council Chair of the College Democrats of America, and he's a frequent speaker and commentator on political and civic engagement, especially among the youth. While not in legislative session, he works as the National Field Director for the Truman National Security Project, where he focuses on national security and its relationship to renewable energy. He's also a Vice Chairman of the Veterans Council of the Democratic National Committee and a member of the Youth Council of the DNC. And again, once again, we have Simone Lightfoot, who has extensive experience working with the NAACP Voter Fund, and Casey O'Shea, who was the DCCC National Field Director in the 2008 cycle. So once again, this panel is about field operations, and it would be great to have each panelist speak for about 15 to 20 minutes each. Then we'll have it open up for questions. So, Casey and Simone, if you want to share your experiences about how to create an effective field operation from the campaign side. But we're going to start with Alex. If he could, please just share your experiences about how does a candidate go door to door? How does he or she go out into the community effectively and run a smart field operation? And what does a candidate really need to know about a field operation? So if we're going to start with you, and then we'll just go down the line.
Thank you very much for inviting me here today. And it's great to see so many people here today. I was privileged to go to the original veterans training last year at Princeton. One of the major differences I noticed is this place doesn't have the Harry Potter type architecture, but it's a lot. Very happy that George Washington University has opened up their space and really taken veterans campaign in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the field operations when you're going door to door. So I represent Brunswick in the state legislature in Maine. It's basically some people at the office at the Truman National Security Project some call me Moose because they think they're Moose in Maine. But in fact, there's actually a relatively urban area, which I do represent, in Brunswick, right on the coast. So the reason why I bring this topic up, because each area you're in is going to be determined how you do door to door. There's some places in Maine that are so spread out that you have to have drivers drive you to each car, and the GPSs don't know where they're going. However, in southern Maine, where I represent, I can park my car and go down the street. So it'll be determinate on each district that you're in. But there are some generalities and very specific things that are common to every door-to-door campaign. But I will say, before you're doing that, you need to be engaged in the community if you're thinking about running. You can't just stop and say, hey, this is a great issue, I need to run. It's very unlikely you're going to get the support. And one of that support comes with working with the community organizations. For instance, I coach lacrosse and soccer in Brunswick. I sit on the board for Habitat Humanity. I did a year of service in AmeriCorps, whatnot. And you slowly get to know individuals. This is before I thought even running. But it helped, interestingly, later on. The other vital part is this is a nonpartisan organization, which is the wonderful thing about it. The nice thing about veterans issues is that I've been able to work across the aisles a lot in the state legislature because of the connection with other veterans in Augusta. However, to get nominated, you do have to be working with your local party officials. And that's the reality of it. The parties will be the one who really ask you to run, and they ask me to run as well. So if you can work with them and build a relationship with them, whatever party it may be, that's vitally important. So the number one thing with field, and you will hear this probably over and over again on this panel, is you have to target. Because if you do not target, you're essentially taking a shotgun when you should be using a slug, so to speak. There are some candidates. I sit on the recruitment committee for in Maine, and there's some candidates that we're ripping our hair out over because they want to go to every single door and say hi to them. Realistically, that's impossible. There's no time, first of all. Second of all, a lot of them may not even vote. So you have to, and then if they're the other party, they're unlikely to vote for you. So this wonderful thing, both sides have this. In the Democratic side, it's called the VAN, Voter Activation Network, or whatnot, Party Bill. You have access to wonderful lists. And these lists are actually pretty sophisticated, especially after the last couple of election cycles. And you can target which member of your party, how many times they vote, if they're likely voters, what gender they are, what age they are, if they went to the party caucuses. All this information is in there. So you build a targeted list, and you have it on your clipboard, or whatever you want. I tend to actually not use a clipboard when I go to a door because it makes it feel like you're selling something. You just have a couple papers and a notepad to write things down with. But when you do that, you have a targeted list, and you'll know before you're going in there their name, who's in the household, what age they are, and you have to pretend not to know, because I made the mistake once. I said, hi, and they said the person's name, and Nancy, and it was like, how'd you know my name? It was like, well, I think I said something. I was like, your bumper sticker on your car or something, there's a note there, and I was being observant. So we became good friends after, so it was a nice intro. So when you go into that targeted list is invaluable, because what you'll do each time you meet a voter, you'll rate them 1 to 5. And if they're 1, you know they're going to vote for you. If they're 5, you know they probably will work against you if you ever show up again, or they'll shoot you on the spot, depending on the state. So as a result, you're going to build a list. And as soon as you get the 1s and 2s, you're going to know and get towards your win number. Sabone is going to talk much more about the win number and how you get to that. So I'd say that's kind of the first step. When you have your walk list, you also have to be very disciplined about keeping to a calendar of scheduling and walking to the doors. So essentially, as the candidate, your job is really to be on the phone and go to doors. And your campaign manager will drag you out of bed and yell at you and say, here's the phone. I know you didn't call all the time because there's not enough minutes on it. Or they'll be like, how many doors did you get to so we can put it in the van? And they'll be realistic about it. So either on the phone raising money, making calls, or going door to door. When you're going door to door, you'll go there, you meet the voter, whatnot. You'll put a note next to their name. And you write now, say there's a big Doberman dog there named Fluffy. And you make a note of it and whatnot. Maybe it's an odd name for the dog and say, hey, wonderful name. But what you do with that is, as soon as you're done with that day of walking, you give it to the volunteers. If you have time yourself, you write what you call a clincher card. And that clincher card is something that you're pre-writing after you met that voter and knew something about them. They told you something, they're interested in education issues. Maybe they're passionate about the local bakery downtown and you help the bakery get their licenses or something. You'll make a note and say, hey, great meeting you. Say hi to the local person down the street, or say hi to their family, whatnot. And then you keep that for a week or so before Election Day, and you mail them all out. So it's a personal note that has a connection to them, reminding them to vote. And you can do that well ahead of time. And they can be pre-written. And then you don't have to write them yourself. Just make sure the same street, that you have the same handwriting person doing it. There was one candidate who, he has a horrible handwriting, but he had this team of little old ladies who had just an eloquent handwriting do it for him. And so it's funny, everyone thought he had the most wonderful handwriting in the district, until they met him one day and realized, that's not you. But then he explained, and just be honest and say, hey, I wrote the notes down, my handwriting sucks, I want you to read it. So that's another contact you're making. You make it at the door, then you can make an easy note to follow up that you're going to send out automatically on basically a postcard, and try to buy forever stamps, by the way, as a side note. And so you need at least 8 contacts to a voter before they really know who you are or thinking of you. But the number one most effective thing is you, the candidate, actually talking to a voter. Some districts you can get to most people. Other districts it's impossible, and you have to go into more TV and direct mail and other things like that. So when you're doing the walk list, you can also do targeted things. If you want to do a targeted mailing, you can go to all the sportsmen. You can go to certain women for organizations. And same thing with the TV. When I buy TV markets, you're not going to go into, for instance, if you're in a progressive district, buying news on Fox News is probably not your voter base. So you'll get to know who demographics or what watch that. Maybe if you're doing retired people, you'll buy the time slot in the afternoon, evening news, whatnot. So the targeting, if there's anything you want to take away from this, is how you target your field campaign. It will be the most important thing you'll be thinking about when it comes to field. So the other thing is when you're walking around every single day, you need to be smart about how you do it. And each district will vary and whatnot. But there's like I said, there are some common things. I mean, and it's sometimes comical too, because you'll knock on the door. A lot of doors, first of all, people don't go to their front door. And so you learn the district. And most people, well, if they park the car in the driveway and you see the side door is the closer one, that's naturally where they're going to go in. So then you go to the side door. The other thing you look at is, are they home? Check the lights. Check to see if the gas meter or the water meter is running with the electric meter, so you know they're home. The other, if it's cold out, and you notice all these things. I mean, look at their license plate. Are they a veteran? What does the decal say of where they served? Do they have bumper stickers like saying they love guns? Well, you might use that to your advantage. You talk about whatever you own. Do they have bumper stickers that say, envision a world with peace? Well, you might want to be a little more moderate on that one. So, you can, because it might be the wife or the husband, who knows, but you need to observe the things when you come to the house. Swing sets for kids, they might be more interested in the local education system, what's going to happen there. And you can be listened to, because it's very funny. When people leave their windows open, you can hear everything in the house. And so you knock on the door, and because the census is going on, I'm going door to door. Like, oh, it must be that census guy coming. Or like, some people will naturally think that you're raising money or an evangelist or something. So honestly, when you're going door to door, it's depending. If you're in a business district, dress up nicer. But realistically, I don't go door to door in a suit. You want to be maybe a collared shirt and khakis is generally what I wear, because you want to relate to them. You do not, when it's cold out, even if it sucks, do not wear a hat because it looks standoffish, especially a black watch cover. Probably not the best idea. The other things, even if you can bear it, to wear lots of layers underneath instead of a big heavy coat. It's much more inviting that you're taking the time, whatnot. And the other aspect is, it is cold out, because when you get to November, obviously, put a hand warmer in your pocket, and so when you shake hands with the person, you don't have cold hands. Is obviously a nice warm handshake. The other tidbit there is, a lot of places have dogs, right? So some have relatively large ones, and when you see in the cartoons the big dog rallying at people, it actually happens. So it's sometimes, if a dog biscuit, don't give it directly to the dog. Give it to the person or the owner to give to the dog. And they're like, oh, cool, he's feeding my dog. Maybe I'll vote for him. Your campaign committee should be doing phone banking for you. So they can sometimes prep an area, whatnot, in the recognized district. One other quick hint with the phone calls is after you go to the door and you know there's no one there and the gas meter's not running, whatnot. just the phone numbers are on that walk list. So if you have your cell phone and you're walking to the next door, just dial it on the way you're walking down and say, hey, this is Representative Alex Poineldu. I just stopped by to say hi. Or actually, you may not say you just stopped by to say hi. You say, hi, I just want to call to say how you're doing. You know they're not home, hopefully. And then leave them a message so they at least have a contact with you, and it doesn't waste you any time either way. So there are all these different aspects when you go there. And the number one thing to take away, I'd say, is you need a 30-second spiel, and you need to make sure you ask for their vote at the end, and to gauge where they're at. The other aspect, number 3, I would say, is to listen. 90% of the people you talk with are not going to get engaged in a policy debate. You have to remember, we're thinking about politics all the time. And most Americans do not think much about politics, like 5 minutes a day or something. A lot of Americans don't even know who the House Speaker is. So they're going to be concerned about the local school. They're going to be concerned about something personal to their lives, home heating assistance, whatnot. So you're going to ask them, like, hey, do you like Brunswick, whatnot? And they're going to say yes. And they say, you want to get your message? I grew up, I coached lacrosse, whatnot. The personal aspect of it as opposed to the policy aspect. Unless you know for a fact that there's an issue they're passionate about that you agree with, why bring up something that you're going to disagree with? So when you're keeping it very generic and listen to them. And the reason why you carry a little notepad is when they give you a suggestion, actually write it down. Because then it tells them that you're serious about what they're saying. You're not just going in one out the other. And people appreciate that you're taking the time to do that. While you're there, if they are supporting you, get their email address, put them on your email system, and ask them about their neighbors. If they trust you, they'll say, hey, you should talk to this person, talk to my neighbor, because they'll know things about the neighbors and whether or not they agree. So you can kind of gather intel for the next house. So if you are giving a 30-second spiel, you need to ask for the vote, whatnot, and then listen to them, you should be okay when you're going to doors. And then finally, when you're doing this, view it as having fun. Because to be honest, when you get up every single day, you're not, just a side note, don't do doors in the morning. People do not like that. There's some candidates who wanted to do that, and they lost votes. The prime time is between 4 to 8. You're going to lose, and when it gets dark out, it's not as productive either. So you probably want to move to call time. So if you target it, you have fun doing it, and you view it, you learn a tremendous amount about your district when you're doing this. And when you listen to people, it'll give you an education as well. So view it as something that's fun to do, about meeting new people, and you'll have a good time doing it. And because ultimately you should care about those issues and why you want to represent them, because those are the people that are putting their trust in you to actually get elected. So I think I'm going to wrap up there, and these guys are going to continue the great discussions. So thank you.
Great points, Alex. The shotgun approach, Alex touched on it. Are you all familiar when we talk about targeting, specifically what we mean? Targeting is what we think of when you're shooting a gun. Who the heck you're going after? That's what the targeting is. We're talking specifically who we're going after. And when we talk about the shotgun approach, so often folk like to just hit everybody. And that's not necessary, nor is it productive. If you look at that, the list, the voter file list, or whatever list you have that tells you who's voting, if you get on a certain block and there's only one person on that block that votes, you really can skip that block, particularly if you're limited on resources and time, and you have a next block with virtually every house on the block demonstrating a pattern of voting. So you have to assess based on the capacity that you have what's the most fruitful approach. But again, make sure whatever door you knock on, you've pre-investigated as much as you possibly can to make that worth your while. When you talk about the whole field piece, and I want to touch on something, you start talking about lurking around folks' water meters, and I'm thinking about Detroit. That wouldn't go over well, but I hear you. That's why I laughed. You have to check the numbers that you need, and there's ways to check the numbers. there's the traditional approaches, I think the more technical approaches Casey will probably touch on, but I like to cross-reference all of that. For instance, I think it's important to go and look at the census data. See what that tells you about the district. You actually, on the census website, can highlight the African Americans in your district, and it'll like make it really green, and it'll show you exactly where, like, whoa, these are, or the Latinos, or the income between this. I mean, you really can do some demographics. And it's a little outdated because it's time to redo that whole thing, but it gives you a sense of your district and where folk are in a way that doesn't cost you as much money as other ways of trying to profile. Make sure you check in your newspapers, the stories in the newspapers that highlight, particularly now they're talking about what states are facing, and so they tend to get into some numbers of where so many % of this is going on here and so much of that. You really want to try to compile those numbers and keep that information. Check out your business Chamber of Commerce website. They really do a good job to talk about numbers. All these places will give you different numbers about different things, but you want to try to cross-reference as much as you can so it gives you perspective. Look at that city or that county or that state's website. They tend to do a good job about talking about numbers, about things going on within their area, so you want to cross-reference that. I'm a big fan of Google Alert. The challenge with that is you end up with 1 million pieces of mail, but it's really nice because whatever you type in, it'll automatically alert you and send you an email about that. So if you're running for Attorney General or State Attorney, I think I heard, you type in Michigan State Attorney, and anything with those 3 words you'll get an email or an alert about it. And it's a way to keep you up on information, particularly if you're still serving and you're planning to run, but you're on a ship somewhere and you won't really be out to serve for another 2, 3, 4 years. It's a way to keep you in the loop about what's happening. It's a way to remind you who to write a check for. Politics is like a soap opera. You really need to know who did what to who last week as to why they're doing what they're doing this week. It really is. And if you don't keep up with that, I mean, you really demonstrate your naivete about the process. If the mayor's pissed at the city council president, you don't want to go up to the city council president talking about how great the mayor is. You just don't necessarily want to do that. Make sure that you are very clear on the type of information you want to get the Google alert about. Be very specific. But it's just invaluable to get that information, and it allows you to keep up with what's going on. Look at the universities and the educational institutions in your area and the nonprofits. They do a lot of research and a lot of white papers and all of that. They tend to do a good job on highlighting some things that are going on within an area and provide you not only data but issues that have already been pre-vetted, if you will. Look at your schools, your public schools websites. They do a great job at highlighting the numbers of students and the test scores, and so you get to be a little more learned about what's going on educationally. Check out your health department's website. They do a good job on health stats and things of that nature. And then, of course, you want your clerk and your keeper of the records. I don't know, it could be your clerk, it could be your Secretary of State, depending on what office you're running for, but you want to get that. Now, be very clear on field operations. It costs money. This is where you put out a lot of money here. Media is a big chunk too. But field ops in the last weeks of the election is costly because you're doing your mailers, you're doing your follow-ups, you're doing your yard signs, you're purchasing more yard signs because you've run out because so many people have asked for them. And if you have extra money, you get into the bumper stickers and the buttons. And I'm not a big fan of that, but it depends on the race again. If it's more local, you really can keep your money and resources more close to the race than, the shotgun broad approach. You have to know what your number is, what they call the win number. And I want you to try to take notes on this. I hope I explain it. When I majored in engineering, and it was a formula-based profession. If you could remember that formula and plug it in, you could get your answers. When you talk about the win number, it's not the 50% plus 1 that a lot of people like to say, because you really want to provide yourself the cushion that's necessary. That one person that could take you over the top could also be the one that gets sick and doesn't show up to the polls that day. So you really want to add anywhere from a 7 to 10% increase in what that 50% over 1 is. So when you're talking about finding that win number, you want to get the win number overall, but you also want to get it precinct by precinct. You want to know specifically which precinct is the high turnout, the low turnout. You want to get what we call an index. That'll tell you it can be a Republican Party index or Democratic Party index, and that's really a reflection of how the folk in that precinct vote, and I'll tell you how to get those too. You have to take into consideration if you're running in a special election, if you're running in a statewide election. You know, special elections have lower turnouts, shorter time span to get your money and your decisions made. Somebody passed away, dropped dead, and now they have to fill that seat, and the filing deadline is 20 days from now, and the election is another 30 days, and you have to raise money. So special elections are they're cool in the sense that it's shorter time span, but they're difficult because it's shorter time span. You understand what I'm saying? So be clear. If you're doing statewide, if you're doing district-wide, if you're doing a term-limited seat or a citywide seat or a partisan seat versus non, all those dynamics come into play as to what kind of numbers you need to look at. Is it an off-year election where not a lot of folk, and when we say off-year, that means non-presidential, a lot of folk don't show up for that? Is it a presidential election where more folks show up to the polls? Is the governor on the ballot that time out? What's the drop-off? And drop-off means simply if you start out off at the top of the ballot with the president getting 1,000 votes, and as you make your way down now to maybe city council and the total votes there was 700, well, you've had a drop-off. And then you go down further and you get to the dog catcher, and that's 100 votes. That's a big drop-off. By the time they get down to your race, if yours, wherever it's located, you have to try to assess what that drop-off is so that you have an idea of what kind of numbers you need to get. And where you're positioned on the ballot does tend to be impacted by what's called the drop-off rate. When you talk about the precinct by precinct, look, you want to try to get the last 3 to 4 election cycle results. Again, that's money, because you have to go to the clerk's office and you have to pay for that, whether it's on a CD, hard copy, whatever. And you ask them for the last 3 to 4 election cycles roughly. Some folk would say less, some would say more. I like apples to apples. I like to compare the last 2 presidential races and the last 2 gubernatorial races and the last 2 state house races, not the presidential race and the governor's race. Numbers are different. You want to try to compare apples to apples. So if you say, for instance, got the 2008, 2006, 2004, and 2002 numbers, precinct by precinct, that gives you an idea, a better idea. You got 2 presidentials there, and you got 2 off-year elections to compare. Project the vote turnout. And I'm going to tell you how you project. You hear people talk about what's the projected turnout. What's the projected turnout? The projected turnout, let me see if I can read this formula. You take the average turnout for the last 3 elections. So you take those last 3, you add them up, you divide it by 3. Got that? Take the last 3 elections, add them up. See, I have to have things repeated to get it. I'm not, I don't just get it all the time right away. But you take those average, you divide it by 3, take those 3 numbers, divide it by 3, and that'll give you your the average. You multiply that by the current number of registered voters. Okay? So an example, year 1 we had 100 votes turnout, year 2 we had 200 votes turnout, year 3 we had 300 votes turnout. That's a total of 600. You divide that by 3, that gives you an average of 200 votes. And then you take that 200, or that average, and multiply that by the current registered voters. And that'll give you your projected turnout. It's not absolute, but it's a number that gives you a perspective on where you need to be. Did you get that? I want to make sure you got that before I move on. Okay. The next thing you want to make sure you're clear on is what's called the AVs. And that's the absentee vote, if you haven't heard that before. And that's the killer of an election. It really is, because you can work your butt off to get folks to the polls. But those seniors, those veterans that are overseas or out of town, those folks that are out of town, we call them snowbirds in Michigan. They leave Michigan during the winter months and go to Florida and still vote back absentee. You want to make sure you get that mailing list. Another cost from the clerk's office. But you make sure you get those folks, because they're regular voters, the absentee voters. And I've been a part of some races before I got into campaigns. When I was in the State House, I watched State House races lost because they really ignored the absentee vote. And oftentimes what happens is they count the folk that came to the polls so you're watching the election results, and it's the results coming from the folk who went to the polls. And then when they start counting those absentee votes, you start watching numbers go way the opposite direction than they had been. So make sure you find out the numbers as far as it relates to the absentees, and make sure you get the list of names and addresses of the absentees. You really want to hit those folks because, again, they have a great tendency to vote. Make sure you know your district boundaries. Get the district boundary map, another cost. But make sure you know the boundaries of your district so that you can articulate that to people, and so you know that walking across the street and knocking on the door is actually outside your district. You need to be very clear on that. You want to also get voter lists. Those were touched on. Name, information on the voters, their regularity of voting. You want campaign signs, regulations. Make sure you know the regulations as you're doing your field op. You don't. If in certain areas you can't put yard signs in thoroughfares, in medians. You don't want to do that. Some areas will fine you. It depends on the city ordinance or whichever office you're running from. And then in some places you see where there's just stuff everywhere. You come into certain areas and there's placards on buildings or over freeways and that type of thing. But be very careful with that because that too talks about you as a candidate. If you're willing to go plaster, buildings with your stuff and then don't go back and take it down, that tends to be problematic. But more significantly, they'll nail you in the papers for us. Another reason for your opposition to just blast you because you didn't know the rules. And also when I talk about knowing the rules, know the basic public disclosure requirements. Know what you have to do and the deadlines that you have to do it. Another way a lot of folks get nailed just on bad press is you miss a campaign filing date, or you're late, or you're fined. And that's simply because your team may not have been on top of what it is that they needed to do. When you talk about your goals for your field operation, your goals, your strategies, and your tactics, campaigns evolve from macro strategies, if you will. Your goals are the broad changes that you want to achieve. The strategy will guide you how to get to your goals. And then the tactics that you use are the details of how you do it. And so make sure that you really work through your goals, then your strategies, and then your tactics. If you all have not read The Art of War, have you guys read The Art of War? How many hands? Oh, wow. Veterans, great, I tell you. The Art of War with Sun Tzu, it's 13 chapters, and it's really good reading for those military folk, and it really helps with the whole military campaign style type of mindset. And so I'd encourage you to look at that. I wanted to also touch on what Alex talked about, and that was not knowing everything or being quiet. It's so important that you don't think you need to know everything. That's so critical. So often those folk that are running for office tend to feel the need to prove that we're worthy and that we're very up on it. And more times than not, voters just want to hear you listen. And the way to do that is to say, well, what do you think? What do you think? And people are more than willing to go on and on about what they think. And you don't necessarily have to articulate whether you agree or disagree all the time. If they ask your opinion and enlist that and you feel comfortable, that's fine. But more times than not, really listen because they'll tend to add perspective that you might not have had. I was talking to some of the vets upstairs, and we were talking about how being a veteran, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Does it help? And the one thing that I've found about being a veteran, it depends on where you come from. If you come from a small town and there was no industry and that was the way out, military is like, hey, cool, great. If you come from a town like Ann Arbor, Michigan, where the whole world revolves around your brain, and you say you're going to go to the military, it's like, ooh. What's ooh? And so you're seen in some instances as you can't be quite bright if you had to go to the military. Because if you were really smart, you'd stay and you'd go to University of Michigan, you'd go to Michigan, you'd go to college. So the fact that you have to go to the military says that you need someone to direct you and guide you. You're not self-directed. You need someone to provide you a manual on how to operate. And so when one of the former panelists were up here, they were talking about how the whole veteran thing can be a blessing or a curse. It just depends on how it's used. When you come home and you articulate and you know the subject matter and you immerse yourself in what it is that's going on, that coupled with being a veteran is then a good thing. But just being a veteran alone, you get people's eyebrows. You really have to sort of prove yourself. And I found that it's important to do that to dissuade some of those particular prejudices. Some of you may or may not run into that, but I've seen that. Make friends before you need them for your field operations. Make friends before you need them. One of the frustrating things about politics is sometimes how disingenuous some of the folk can be that are in it, and it's sort of like the glad handling, slap your back, hey, how you doing? Oh yeah, you're great, and you know they don't even remember your name. You know, so make sure that you're reaching out to your faith community, your civic groups, your vet groups, your education community, the business community, organizations. Those folk that participate in those type of venues or things tend to be people who are willing to volunteer and tend to be people who know what it takes to get things done, and they're willing to do it. Know your demographics. Know the way they vote. I run into so many people that say they want to represent a district or a city or a county or a state, and they don't even know the rate of illiteracy, or they don't know how many people have health insurance or not, or how many people actually have children or not. They just don't know much about the district. Oftentimes as military folk, we're gone. And so we haven't, it's changed in the last 8 years, 10 years, our hometown, if that's where we're going to be. So make sure that you do all that you can to really know what it is that's going on there. What's the immigration status of the community since you've been gone? What are the actual shortcomings of the community, like a Detroit, now that the auto industry has basically bottomed out, and that state's whole lifeblood was the auto industry. It wasn't diversified. It was all cars. And so now you have a town that's standing around going, what do we do now? What do we do now? You need to know that. If you come back in talking about rah-rah Chrysler Ford, you know, like it was before you left, you demonstrate you're really out of touch. And that's absolutely critical. Know their political standing in the community. When you left, you might have had a mayor that the governor loved. You guys were getting great money. It was a great relationship. Well, since then, a new governor's in or a new mayor, and they don't even like each other. So the state has cut your city off, and there's no love between your state and your city. And so you need to know that politically speaking, when you walk in and say you're from that town and people kind of look at you crazy, you'll understand the dynamics politically that have gone on. You'll see the difference in work that you may have to do and the credibility that your community now has or does not have anymore. And also know the political will of the people. You know, our former mayor, Kwame Kilpatrick, left office. He's the gift that keeps giving, though. We're still paying bills, I tell you. But he left office, and our city, under such a horrible cloud, we had 5 mayoral elections in 1 year because of that. Millions of dollars to run these elections, to have these elections. So the political will of the people are tired. They're tired. And and this young brother, there was a young brother over there in his 30s somewhere saying he was going to run. The challenge with situations like that is when a Kwame Kilpatrick gets into trouble, it's difficult for voters to embrace anything under 30. Anything under 30. Y'all young people ain't paid your dues. You need to go back and get some training. It's too much too soon. And so there's a cost that's paid for a long time for those types of challenges that go on. You need to be aware of the political will and sentiment of the folk in your community. Don't necessarily be so quick to call them apathetic. No, they're just beat down. They're beat down, and you need to know that, and your message needs to reflect that and be uplifting. And last but not least, field. Field is critical. The final days are just absolutely critical. Let your folk that you've brought on board do what they do. Don't make that the time you begin to micromanage. As the candidate, you start getting really nervous. You start wanting to make sure that everybody's doing what they're supposed to do, and you're kind of edgy because the polls are saying this or the media is saying that. Try to keep it calm. Work your plan. Stick to your plan, and you should be more successful than you might think during that nervous time. So I look forward to your questions.
One of the most amazing things to me working on so many campaigns is how many campaigns never actually do the basic math that they need to do in order to figure out how many votes they need to win. I mean, I walked into, probably more than 10 congressional races where you walk in and you say, well, how many votes do you need to win? And they go, well, what? I mean, I don't know. Why is that important? Well, it turns out it's really important. It turns out that of, probably the 3 central documents that at any campaign, above like the school board, county commissioner level where you may not be running a poll, but one of the 3 main documents beside your poll, your poll, and I'm blanking on the other one right now. Is your field plan and is doing that actual number of votes that you need to win. Your budget, sorry, that's the other one. And the field plan and the poll should drive the budget. So I'll back up just a little bit here. There are two different types of field. There's grassroots field and there's grass tops field. Grass tops field, you might also have heard of it called political outreach. It's sort of like going and greasing the local party chairman and making sure they're feeling the love and all that kind of stuff. The grassroots is more, this is direct voter contact. This is really X's and O's, mathematical, quantitative stuff. This is how many repetitions are you getting in to this defined universe of voters that you need to move in your direction in order to get to 50 plus 1% or 52%. There are, a lot of tools, a lot of fancy pants tools that everybody uses now, but the main thing that you need to make sure your campaign buys is the voter file, and you can get that typically from your state party if you're a Democrat or a Republican. Republicans, I think, call it Voter Vault, and ours is the VAN, Voter Activation Network. After you've set, okay, and here's the formula, right? Once you do your analysis, and we've had a lot of talk about all the tools that are available. There's voter history, historical election returns. Once you've sort of set your turnout, it is a very simple number, right? You know what the base vote is probably going to be because you can look and see what a Democrat who barely even had a pulse got in, the last election. Say if you're in a very conservative district, what did John Kerry get, right? Maybe it was 38%. You look at that number, and then you figure out how many votes you need based on what you project the turnout is to get to 52%. That number, what that ultimately does is you overlay that with your polling, and your poll is going to say, well, these groups move in our direction, right? Like white women over 50 move in our direction once we deliver these negatives against our opponent or these positives about us. So you're going to drill down on that group of people, and you're going to hit them over and over and over and over and over and over again until they finally get the message. And like I said earlier, it usually takes about 10 repetitions. So your field plan should be designed to hit this group of people, and you use the voter file, right? If the poll says it's white women over 50, you go into the file, you select the white women over 50 who are likely to vote, and you drill down on that universe. In a congressional race, it usually runs around 30 to 40,000 households that you want to hit over and over and over, at least 10 times. So your field plan needs to be designed to hit these people 10 times. There are different tactics available. There's direct mail, which a lot of campaigns, all the way up and down the ballot use. It's a great way to get, maybe 4 or 5 or 6 of those reps. They're the doors. And this is your persuasion universe I'm talking about right now. I'm not talking about GOTV. These are the people you've got to push to get you to 52%. And then there are phones. And, phones can be volunteer or paid. It's pretty rare you see a campaign that can generate the internal volunteer capacity to saturate a universe in a very, very quick amount of time, especially if you're talking about 40 or 50,000 phone calls that need to be made. And if you're going to actually get a contact, probably going a little too deep here, but typically the average person, you're not going to talk to them the first time you try to talk to them. So it's going to take 2 or 3 passes. Contact rates depend on the state and the political culture. Like Jersey, where I've done a lot of work, people don't pick up the phone in Jersey. I don't know why they don't do it, but they don't do it. Rural Arkansas, everybody picks up the phone. Why that is, I don't know, but that's just the way it is. Typically in your plan, you want to build capacity to do those 3 reps for every message that you want to deliver. Let's see, I've talked about persuasion, message delivery. I don't know if I made this point enough, but it's all about repetition and consistency to your persuasion universe and to your GOTV universe. This is delivering the same message over and over. I don't know if anyone's talked about this today, but even as a candidate, you're going to give the same stump speech over and over and over and over. Same concept. So if it seems like it's excessive and it's overkill and maybe a couple people call and they say, oh my God, I've gotten like 100 phone calls from your campaign, you should say, yes, that's what I want. Because that means your message is finally penetrating. And there are a lot of things out there competing with your campaign to get people's attention. So I've talked a little bit about the voter file targeting. There are also groups in the Democratic Party. There's a group called National Committee for an Effective Congress, which is sort of like a data warehouse that has been tracking elections all the way back to Franklin Roosevelt. They generate a baseline statistic called democratic performance, which is sort of how you figure, like, if I wheeled a dead body out with a D next to its name, how many votes would it get? DPI obviously sets that baseline number that you can then figure out how many votes you need to persuade in order to win. And they provide that information free of charge to campaigns. They provide it as an in-kind contribution. And I guess the last, major new tool that's available to campaigns, aside from traditional things like polling and basic, scut work of looking at electoral history and things like that, is micro-targeting and modeling. Usually, larger federal campaigns use this kind of stuff, although party committees are making it more and more available to campaigns. And basically, this is a model, an algorithm that generates a statistical probability that a voter will either A, turn out, or B, is persuadable to your cause, or if they're likely to go to church, or if they're likely to be in the Elks Club, or whatever. They make all kinds of models for all kinds of things, but the basic ones are turnout models, which help you target turnout a little bit more precisely than just looking at electoral history, and persuasion models, which generally tell whether a person could, whether they're a swing voter or not, basically. We've already, we've run through some examples, so I'll spare you that. Talked about the tactics, the difference between grass tops and grassroots. Oh yeah, the AV and EV. Absentee and early voting. In some states, and you should pay a lot of attention to this, because what you're seeing is states that have introduced absentee and early voting in particular, the numbers are just exponential. The number of people who are starting to vote earlier and earlier. Like in one state in particular, I was just running the numbers for one of my clients. The first year of early voting, it was 7%. The second year, it was 14%. The next year, it was 21%. And now it's like 45% of the people in the state vote before Election Day even happens. This is very important, not just for your field operation, but for the way that you're communicating with voters and when you're communicating with them. You don't want to get to the end of early voting and have someone say, what was your early vote plan? And you realize that half of the people have already voted and you haven't even gone up on TV yet. That happens. That's why these things, paying attention to these details is very important. Let's see, a couple of other things. Paid versus volunteer. There are two different cultures in field operations. Volunteer field obviously is exactly what you're talking about. Volunteers on the phones, volunteers canvassing. Volunteers can be very effective. Especially at IDing and persuading with positive messages. Republicans in particular are very effective at volunteers, utilizing volunteers and recruiting them. Democrats just kind of caught up, I think, in this last election cycle. A lot of that depends on the enthusiasm of your base. Is it motivated or not? Are these folks going to show up and put in the hours on the phones? Because that's very hard work for volunteers to do. Paid culture is a lot different, and typically it's sort of regional. A lot of southern states, the paid field is very normal. A lot of urban areas, paid field is very standard. If you're not paying people, they're not working, period. And you're talking about $10 an hour per canvasser. You're talking about lining up, and this is GOTV, obviously, but you're talking about renting a dozen vans, and this is a logistically very complex thing, and all kinds of bad things can happen along the way to Election Day, like vans get lost that you rented. Once I had a canvasser give birth on someone's doorstep. We probably should have screened a little tighter on the initial interviews. But paid field can be a much different exercise than volunteer field. But sometimes it's necessary. What you have to do is you have to figure out on the way in, how many shifts am I going to need to fill in order to hit my goals, in order to hit my persuasion universe 3 times. And if your volunteers aren't getting it done, you may need to hire a paid phone bank, or you may need to hire a paid canvas to get there, if that's part of your strategy and your plan to win. And I'll speak just a little bit to GOTV. It's a different kind of targeting than persuasion targeting. You're looking for people in GOTV who are less likely to vote, but might have some history of voting in an off-year election in the past. Last cycle, when I was at the DCCC, our targets were people who we thought were going to come out to vote for Obama, but might drop off and not vote for the House candidate because they didn't care. So we hit those people, a dozen times with a $20-something million field operation that we ran. And that was really the main thrust of it, was to make sure everybody who showed up went all the way down the ballot and voted for our guys too. And in a regular election, you are looking for the people who, maybe they, like this year, for instance, you're looking for the people who voted in '08 but didn't vote in '06. Those are the ones you want to hit with your GOTV. And you only want to go to places where you're turning out a vote that's for you. So you want to go to your base precincts, you want to go to the precinct where you were born, you want to go to where your poll says. Your poll might say that, you're getting 90% of African Americans. Well, that means it's pretty safe to go into the African American neighborhoods and grab every living soul you can find and turn them out. It might be saying, that white men over 50 can't stand you. Stay out of those precincts. Every vote you turn out there is probably going to hurt you. So, those things are all things to think about. And the last thing is, this is more of a fundamental strategic thing about field. Field is a really good tool to move you 3 to 5 points. But at the end of the day, if you've polled and it shows you're a 4% and you need to get to 34 in order to win a primary and get out and make it to the general election, you're going to have to invest more of your money in more of a broad, massive turnout operation. If your poll shows you're close, and it could come down to a few hundred votes, a few thousand votes, and you'll know this, if you're running a good campaign, you're going to poll again probably 2 to 3 weeks out to figure this kind of stuff out. Then you make those decisions. So, that being said, I don't think I have anything else to add to that. Questions? Your pollster should, the way this should work on a good race is, you'll baseline poll, and that'll sort of set the stage. It'll help you develop the themes of your campaign. It'll help you figure out which groups you need to move. That shows you the path to victory to 52%. Your poll should do that, and the way that is developed is your whole campaign team, your consulting team, the staff, should all get on a call. You should ask the pollster to generate a questionnaire in advance. And then you sort of pick it apart and you say, are we asking the right questions here? The candidate needs to inform that decision with any local dynamics the consulting team doesn't pick up because they might be in Washington or somewhere else. Same with the staff who are involved at the strategic level. I wouldn't have the interns on that call, but some campaigns do. But, and then the follow-up poll is usually called a tracker in industry terms. Same process. You'll have seen some things that have happened. Maybe someone's been attacking you in direct mail or on the phones or on TV, and you want to see how effective that attack was and whether you need to respond to it or not. A poll can tell you that kind of stuff. And obviously, it needs to be a collaborative process because this document, more than anything else, this document is going to drive your budget and it's going to drive your field plan at the end of the day. Yes, your opponent. Yes, if you trip $600 that you're paying to a canvasser, you should 1099 them for sure. Some campaigns go the extra length and actually make people employees. That's very rare, and all of those things have to be disclosed to the FEC. If they're not, and when you're running a paid canvas, it's like one of the million things that can go wrong with the paid canvas is improper compliance. And you should see on a campaign that's done a paid canvas a lot of disbursements in the $50, $60, $150, $200 range for those people's hourly work. If the FEC hates this too, and here's the problem with the FEC, is their budget has just been totally slashed. They have a lot less staff to deal with these complaints. And actually, they exist now more on they're like the cops in a small town who have to write a lot of tickets in order to buy the new cruiser. That's kind of how they have to run. It's hand to mouth, and they have an incredible backlog. So I don't want to give you too much hope that this would get resolved anytime in the next 2 to 3 years. Well, and the thing that you look for is when there's like a $15,000 check written to one person and it's consulting. That usually means someone has got a lot of money and they're sort of paying people in cash, which is not legal on a federal campaign if it's over $200. So
another thing too, one of the challenges with the paying the canvassers is, particularly in urban settings, is just getting the information from the folk you're paying, getting them to show you ID and give you a social security number and give you that information, because sometimes they don't have that type of ID. More times than not, they don't want to disclose that, and so that's another component. And one way around that is to address the amount of money that you're able to give out, and it's minimal. But just be sure that you're very clear that that information is needed and required if they're going to work for your campaign, because you'll have folk looking at your campaign finance report saying, hey, you didn't do it the right way.
And Simone's absolutely right. The FEC requires names, addresses, and socials for anybody who gets paid. So your campaign should have all of that.
No, that's a really good question, because one of the things you really have to do is be very disciplined about taking care of yourself. Because if you get sick during the last week, you're you could be done. Because if you can't go door to door, you can't make those calls because you have strep throat, that's going to knock you out of some serious and valuable time. So one of the things I always try to do is you have to make a schedule by which time you have to go to bed and get the required number of hours to stay healthy. You want to make sure that you're not eating all the volunteers' food, which is generally pizza, right? And so you do have to keep, we always think of it as a marathon and not a race, because you're starting literally at least a year out when you're running. And when it starts in the beginning, in the summertime, it might be a little bit slower, and you're doing a lot of breakfast meetings, you're doing a lot of meetings in the afternoon. So it's part of into the campaign plan. When you write your campaign plan and timeline, you start from election day back and whatnot, and you get extremely detailed down to the fact that you will schedule in a couple days of relaxation in there at strategic points. And if a friend of yours is getting married and you really want to go to that, you need to schedule that in so it's on this campaign plan. That's how detailed you have to get if you're serious about winning. The other aspect is a lot of state legislatures are part-time. So you have a lot of people who have a second job if you're not independently wealthy or retired. Like myself, I work for the Truman National Security Project as my other job, aside from being in the state legislature. So likewise, I have to be very careful about how I schedule those things. But some people I've seen, they literally work themselves to get 3 hours of sleep a night, and in the end, when you're going door to door and you say something really quite dumb to the voter because you're not together and you're not there. And so you can make mistakes when you don't take the time to schedule it directly out. So my always thing was, as long as I get to the gym at least 3 times a week and you get maybe at least 6-7 hours a night, you try to stay as healthy as possible, and then stay away from all the pepperoni pizza as much as you can.
I just want to touch on something. By the time, though, you get to the field plan portion, all those meetings with the important folks should have taken place, because you're talking about the last few weeks. You may have a few here and there, but in general, your meetings tend to go on before the work part gets rolling. And the other part is, campaigning is going to probably be one of the most unhealthy times of your life. It really does suck the life out of you if you're really doing the work. If you're able to get 6 hours, that's great, particularly down into the third 3 week out, 4 week out. You're just running a marathon, and oftentimes it's difficult. Also, if you're over 40, I'm with you on the diet thing. When you were younger and dumber, you could do that stuff, man, but your body starts letting you know, I need more than pizza. And so you really have to deliberately make sure you're eating right, because you can pay for that in more ways than one, too.
I'm a former congressional chief of staff also, so the franking privilege is nice. It's something that can give an incumbent a very large head start on you. Obviously, you're experiencing that right now, so I don't need to belabor that point. I would say this: early communication.
Could you explain?
Sorry, the franking privilege is basically a member is given something called an MRA, Members Representational Allowance. It usually runs somewhere between $1 million and $1.4 million. A lot of different factors influence that. Franked communication is communication that is approved by an official House body called the Franking Commission. A member, I don't think there's necessarily any limit on the amount of money that a member within that $1.3 million budget can spend. Obviously, they have staff that they have to pay for. They have to pay for, their LAs, their chief of staff, and everything else, and all of their office supplies, and all their travel has to come out of that budget. So whatever's left over, they tend to use to frank. And I've seen that number run anywhere between nothing to $300,000 of that 1-point-something million that they've got. So that's the frank. So it is a official taxpayer subsidized communication that members can send at their discretion. They can't use any political targeting to send it out, no party registration or anything like that. But they can look at gender and a few other factors, geography, in determining how they send that mail and how they target it. And typically, it's like the newsletter you get from your congressman that's like, I'm going to be in your neighborhood, in 3 weeks to do a town hall. The other thing members can do with frank communication is they can do teletown halls, they can do phone calls announcing that they're going to have, town halls and things like that, close by. But like I said, it's all approved. It's all legit. People attack it. What I would do if I were you is I would attack it. I would say, this is crazy. Send out a press release. The taxpayers are subsidizing this, and it's clearly a campaign tactic. That's I've done that a couple of times also when I was on the other side.
Been on both sides of that issue.
At the end of the day, though, it's they have the right to do that. Now, in terms of your strategy needs to be what gets you to 52%. And if you're reacting to the franked mail that gets sent out, you're going to be spending money to do that if you're doing it with paid communications. That's why I would say do a press release, do some earned media on it. You need to, and you're running against an incumbent, right? So you're going to have to focus your resources at the point of maximum impact for you. Whereas this guy can send out whatever he wants to send out, however, as long as, 2 years before Election Day on the taxpayer, you're going to have to focus your resources and make sure they're firing when it counts. And the research shows, frankly, and that's why I wouldn't worry this much about this, that early communication, way early communication is not that effective. Yeah.
I wanted to just back that up, what Casey said. There's some level of that type of responding that goes on in campaigns, but you really want to try to minimize that because you kind of come across sometimes, particularly when you're not the incumbent, as a disgruntled, wannabe, in office kind of guy versus staying focused on your race and telling the voters what you'll bring to the table. And if you don't have the resources to do both, I would venture on the side of focusing on what I would bring to the table.
It's a totally different kind of targeting in a primary race. You're looking, primaries are about your base, really more than anything else, maximizing the turnout from wherever you're from or whoever amongst the people who know you. And you need a lot fewer votes to win a primary than you do a general election. You got to figure out how many votes that is. If it's 34% and your poll says you're at 9, it's the same math, but it's just a smaller slice. And you also don't have the benefit of partisanship. I mean, you can look at registered Democrats and Republicans and you get a pretty good feel for how the electorate breaks down, and you can look at historical returns in presidential campaigns and general elections. They can really provide you a much better benchmark for what your baseline is. But if you've never run before, it's going to be really hard to figure out where your base is and where those votes come from. And that's why communication, paid communication in a primary needs to really drill down and go after and create a base for yourself if you've never done this before.
And it also really depends on which state and your election laws are, because in some states you have open primaries where independents can vote. Other states like Maine, it's closed. So only the registered voters from that party can vote. And then there's rules about how many days beforehand they can shift their registration and whatnot. So that'll determine your strategy, how you need to run that race.
And then generally in the primary races, you're sharing the base. You know, the Republicans are sharing the base, the Democrats are sharing the base, and so you got to pick it off. And I think Casey touched on it in the sense that it also depends on how many people are in that race. 6 versus just 2 of you all. And then, of course, once you get to the general election, it's opposite parties going at it.
Right. That's why if you're not well known, you want as many people in a primary as you can get.
That's right.
They split up
Less
the vote.
percentage, that's right, that you need to win.
The first thing you need to do is make sure that the state that you're in allows robocalls. Like Indiana, no robocalls. Okay. For those who are operating in other states here, you need to check that out for sure, because they'll charge you $100 a call that goes out, which is a lot. Robocalls, I think there's a use for robocalls. I think when you're talking to your base and pathological voters, they're more likely to listen all the way through to a robocall. I think often something I've done is I've looked at pathological primary voters in the Democratic Party, since that's the party I'm in. I'll do a robocall that has an automated response to those folks that says, you want to volunteer? And it's a great way to run through a list really quick and sort of pick off the low-hanging fruit, and then have your volunteers follow up with everybody else you can't get. Another really good use is if you're going to be canvassing a neighborhood, it's good to send a robocall out before the canvass happens and let people know that you're coming, so they're kind of primed for it and it's not a big surprise. They'll some people might actually internalize that they got the call and they'll be waiting for you, The other thing I like to use robocalls is in between mail pieces to sort of create a bridge of communication and tie things together for the voter. I recently sent you a mail piece about my plan to fix the economy, and I'm going to be sending you another one next week about my plan to create more capacity at 2-year colleges in Virginia. Just to sort of you got to connect the dots for voters, because they're really not paying attention to this stuff, and that's sort of another way, if you have extra money, to use robocalls. And the last thing I would say would be for GOTV. They can be a pretty effective tool, especially if you're sort of operating in a low turnout kind of environment where there won't be total saturation of them. That's something else you have to be cognizant with robocalls. Since they are so cheap, everybody does them. And man, I worked in Iowa and for a presidential candidate in the caucuses, and people were getting 30, 40, 50, 60 phone calls a night, and it was driving them crazy. So they can start to suppress the vote after a while too. So you have to sort of calculate, is this going to provide a return on my investment?
And then the telephone town hall?
Oh yeah, teletown halls. A lot of congressmen do these with their franking privilege now, as well as political campaigns. I really like these things. They generally cost anywhere between $2,000 and $20,000, depending on how many voters actually sign on to the call. But basically the way it works is a robocall will go out the night before and say, it'll be the member or the candidate saying, I'm going to call you tomorrow night for a teletown hall between the hours of 7 and 9 p.m., and I want to hear what you have to say. Well, and the next night, the robocall goes out and tells folks to press a button if they want to opt in and join. It's basically a gigantic conference call. And you have a moderator who can screen the questions and sort of line up the ones that you want to answer. Some members don't even do that. They just take them as they come. But the other thing you can do with those is you can collect data. One thing I like to do with a persuadable universe of voters is call it, do a teletown hall, have the candidate deliver the message, and then have people do the 1 through 5 that Alex is talking about at the end of the call. And you can collect a lot of IDs that way. The other way you can use it is with your base. And you can have the candidate address the entire base of the district, entire Democratic or Republican base, and then ask people to volunteer at the end of their spiel. It's a good way to get volunteers.
Just to harp on that a little bit, I actually just did one for my district. And it was telling people about the circuit breaker tax program we have in Maine that's coming up. So if there's a specific issue, like a tax program or something that provides information to the voters, they'll welcome that information. Interestingly, too, you'll get a lot of people who don't even realize it's recording. And so a lot of people, if you leave a callback number, I've had a lot of people call back and we've had good luck chatting with them about it, what's not. Because the other thing is the timing. Sometimes you'll try to time it so when you know that they're not home, so it goes onto the answering machine and it looks like you just called to leave a message. So it's one of the other tactics we've played with to doing. The patch through is another thing I've used where to gather volunteers. That if you're interested, press 1 and it patches through to someone.
Whoever, depending on who the person is, impacted how long they actually held the call and actually listened through. When Bill Clinton called, people would listen to the whole conversation. They had a sense of nostalgia. They were actually talking. But when it's folks that they didn't know or a candidate that's new to the run, they didn't get the same length of being heard. They would hang up. So you want to take that into account when you talk about doing a robocall.
Your pollster should help you figure out the balance of communication. If it's more of a base race, your poll will tell you that. If it's more of a situation where you need to spend more of your dollars on persuasion, your poll will also tell you that. I typically like to time my persuasion campaign to dovetail with whatever other direct voter contact is going on. So if I'm hitting doors at the same time the mail is dropping, with a script that mirrors the mail and with a literature piece that mirrors what the mail is, because at the end of the day, this is all just about the number of repetitions you're getting into that universe. So, and typically your mail will start to drop between, 4 and 8 weeks out. So you want to do the bulk of your persuasion canvassing then, unless you're trying to do something else and like deliver a message under the radar. Maybe you need to do a hard negative against your opponent, or you need to contrast information on your record and theirs, and you don't necessarily want it to be on TV, especially if you're in a primary situation where if someone is caught delivering negatives, it blows votes off of you and they go to, like they went to John Edwards in Iowa when it was Howard Dean and Dick Gephardt attacking each other. But that is another way to deliver those messages sort of like below the radar screen.
Okay. I want to thank the panelists again for their time.